Hello, everybody, and welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly webinar where we dig deep into the politics of big tech. And we're now, as I think we shared with you last time, repurposing this into a spiffing what do we call them? Podcasts, which is a new thing that all the kids are listening to. So that's really, really exciting. Joining me today, my regular partner in crime, Lizzie O'Shea. Hey, Lizzie.
Hi, great to be here.
And special guest, David Swan from The Australian, where he works as the technology writer, and also Anna Johnson from Salinger Privacy. Hi, guys. Thanks for being part of this. Before we get cracking, recognising we're all on Indigenous land, wherever we are. I am on Gadigal land up here in Sydney, and I know that you will all join me in paying respects to elders past, present, emerging, recognising the land we're all on was never ceded. So for those who are regulars, we encourage you to have your camera on, to use the chat, to make comments, ask questions. If there's anything that really kicks the debate on, we might even bring you into the room and get you to have the floor for a moment. So use the chat, but please be respectful. If you razz us too much, we will kick you out, as we had to somebody last fortnight. And apart from that, the format is we're going to dive deep into a few news stories, and then we're going to have a really good half hour where we try to get our heads around what is, I reckon, the toughest issue to really understand as a layperson, which is privacy law. And so Anna's going to sort of lead us through showing us this extent to what we don't know, which should be pretty exciting as well. But let's start off looking at, in a way, the only question and the only story in tech this week, which was the whistleblower from Facebook giving evidence in the US Senate. We've covered the substantive, I think, issues in last week's Burning Platforms, the Facebook files, which were originally published in association with the Wall Street Journal. Then there was a outing of the whistleblower, who ended up being a product manager. And I'm not quite sure how senior that is. David might be able to help me with that in a minute to understand where Frances Haugen fitted into Facebook. She did a 60 Minutes interview last weekend, and then she fronted the Senate, where all sides of the Senate were ready to hear from her and really fire up against what I've described as the tobacco moment for big tech. I thought the other interesting part of her testimony was it was the first time in a really focused way I'd heard legislators engage with the ideas of algorithmic transparency, which is really where her analysis went, that unless Facebook comes clean with the design of its algorithms, we're really taking it on its word. And as her evidence has shown, that is probably not a great place for either the US Senate or humanity in general to be at the moment. So interested, like David, welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you know about this whistleblower and how senior she was and what you think the import of her evidence has been over the last week.
Yeah, and thanks very much for having me, obviously. And she was quite senior in that she was at Facebook's civic integrity team. And that's a unit that Facebook shut down. So that unit no longer exists. And I think that's one of the reasons that she's come forward. Obviously, whistleblowers, generally speaking, have some sort of axe to grind or a reason that they're coming forward. My characterization is that she was quite senior in the company in terms of meeting regularly with senior leadership, and she's not some sort of junior on the ground, as it were. She showed how familiar she was with Facebook's inner workings in her testimony. She was extremely credible, and the documents that she ended up leaking to the Wall Street Journal were substantive, and it was thousands of documents from company research, and she's very credible. And Facebook still hasn't released that research. They've tried to smear her. Mark Zuckerberg released a 1,300 word statement, not apologizing and not saying sorry, but basically smearing her as a witness and saying, she had no direct reports under her, that she was, wrong in what she was saying, which was disgraceful, I thought, as a response from Facebook. But I think you're right. It was the first time that someone's fronted the US Congress like this from the company, putting their name to what they're saying. And yeah, not anonymously, just, fronting it and being truthful, and was found afterwards by both sides of politics in the US to be an incredibly credible witness.
It's interesting, isn't it? That idea of a unity ticket on big tech. Often I find that you get the sense that the right and the left are cracking down on it for totally different reasons, but it seemed a lot more unified this time.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we've seen that in Australia too. It's a really interesting dynamic where you wouldn't expect our centre-right government to have a natural instinct to crack down on big tech. You would have its natural instinct, from what we've seen with other industries, the way they've handled is hands off. We're going to let capitalism kind of run its course. But we're seeing the Morrison government say, we need to take action here, and they have, with the News Media Bargaining Code and with other things. So we're seeing that play out in governments in the US as well, where very much a unity ticket, where you're right, it's for different reasons, but both sides very much recognize actions needed. And I think they're wisened up to this in a way they haven't been before. I think the questions to the whistleblower were very well informed and smart. And in the past, I've been almost embarrassed watching some of that testimony where you'd hear the questions and you'd think, these politicians don't even really understand.
How do you turn on an iPad? Yeah.
Yeah. They don't understand what Facebook is. They don't really get at all the issues. And they do now. And that's really heartening. And it's not just in US, Australia, it's also Europe and elsewhere. So that's heartening, where it feels like a real global moment for big tech.
Lizzie, what's been your reflections watching the testimony and the sort of, is this a house of cards moment, or is this just another issue that can be managed with a well-managed algorithm on the Facebook news feed to filter out all the negative Facebook news?
Yeah, well, I would like this to be a turning point, and I think there's every chance it could be. I think it will take a bit more work. Like, we've known about the dangers of tobacco, you've used this analogy, or asbestos, for example, and asbestos is still mined and used in building materials today. So there's still work to be done, even though we know the product is dangerous, to deal with companies who profit from that danger and from that harm. So I would hope it's the starting point of this conversation, but that, this is the time to lean into the activist work that organisations have been doing across the spectrum of civil society and, in partnership with communities to change the environment in which these companies operate. I think it is interesting that it unites both right and left, but I would say that I do think there'll be a divergence quite significantly on implementation and what you do about this. In part, that's because I think that the conservative politicians love kicking tech companies because they make themselves an easy target, and they aren't really interested in being coherent or perhaps rights respecting is how I describe it. They're much more interested in using that as political capital for their own the furtherance of their own agenda and their own personal ambitions. And I do think we have to think really carefully about how we might tackle harm on these platforms now we know it exists. And one of the things that's come out from these papers or this discussion that I think is interesting is that there are key design decisions that have been made by the company that could be changed that would have a significant impact on harm. So rather than thinking about tackling it from a content perspective, like what kind of content do we want to ban? Because I think that's what the right tends to do. And that has real implications for, freedom of expression, for holding power to account, for all these kinds of things that social media can be effective for. So instead of using that content definition, in fact, looking back at the design decisions that give rise to harm is, I think, a much more useful path, and might be where the right and left sit on this. Because, one of the things that comes out of her testimony is the share button is hugely harmful. And, it's as simple as that in some ways. And I think we could start to talk about how we could have put an imposition upon companies to think about the harm that they produce and take a least harmful path and consider design decisions they make in the context of harm, rather than saying, oh, we're going to ban all content that might be relating to body image, targeting at children, or violent and abhorrent material, which is the other way they approach this, which in fact may then knock people out of these platforms who are doing important educative work or human rights work. So I think that's what we should take from it, that there are key design decisions this company makes. That's where I think we need to start having the conversation about how to fix it.
So just on that, before we get to the content discussion, which is obviously very live in Australia at the moment, what is the logic for algorithmic transparency? So if I'm driving a car, the car needs to meet engineering standards to get on the road. Is this just something that's never been considered, or is it something that's crept up on us? Or I know that there's been one decision by the ACCC where they actually demanded that an algorithm, it wasn't a Facebook algorithm, I think it was a travel website. But what is the logic of keeping your algorithms secret?
I mean, I don't know if you're asking me, but others may wish to jump in.
Ask the world, yeah.
I think it's profit, so it's making money. There's a really interesting project. It's kind of significant. There's an interesting project I saw a few years ago in the US where there was a black box computer tool, so a bit of software that was used to analyze DNA samples in crime scenes. And it turns out, DNA evidence is very compelling, but it turns out you can shed DNA in all sorts of ways in very micro amounts that can then hang around for a really long time. And, essentially these prosecution lawyers use this evidence from a software, black box software program. And then the defense had to, kind of reverse engineer to figure out what had happened. And, this person got off their prosecution, got off their criminal charge. And this is the kind of obvious example of the way in which that closed black box algorithm can lead to injustice, and that you actually do need to examine the decision-making processes, how it's been designed, in order to have confidence that it's doing what it says it does. And then if you're going to make a pretty significant decision about someone's life, then maybe you're entitled to know the thinking, the logic basis on which that's made. I mean, it's funny that you talked about cars, actually, I should say as well, because one of the, the most famous examples, possibly the most significant white-collar crime in human history, was Volkswagen and a number of other car companies gerrymandering their cars so they perform differently when put under tests to release more diesel into the atmosphere. And this affected millions of people who purchased these cars, and over time, and huge amounts of impact on our environment. So the regulation also has to be pretty targeted and specific, and look to challenge companies who might try to conceal how they're doing things from regulators. And open source, opening up these black boxes is obviously the primary best way to do that. I think any testing or auditing also has to be pretty carefully considered, so you don't get a Volkswagen problem as well.
Yeah. David, you've spent a long time covering technology on your journey. How important is the secrecy of algorithms to business models? And can you see a world in which there is more scrutiny towards them?
Yeah, it's sort of everything, really. It's how these companies have grown to be bigger than many companies' GDPs. It's literally where the growth comes from, because the algorithm is the thing that gets to know you, serves you more content in terms of YouTube, for example. It might lead you down a right-wing rabbit hole that you never recover from. In terms of Instagram, it might be that you're a young teenager and that's how you develop your body issues, is from the algorithm assuming certain things about you and serving you more content that's addictive, or more content that's more extreme, because the algorithm likes whatever's the loudest. And it's really harmed democracy globally, I think, because the reasonable voices in the room get left out by the algorithms. I think the whistleblower made an interesting point where she said what you can do is instead change the algorithm so that it's instead just sorts the posts on your feed or the graph by date and order of which it's posted. I know on Twitter you can do that, for example, where instead of letting Twitter decide the most important things for you to see, you just see them in the order in which they were posted. I think that's a common sense way to handle it, for example, where you're not trusting the tech giant's judgment and its algorithms because they've shown they haven't been able to be trusted. I know, for example, in the past, Facebook had a human team that was selecting its news stories. One of my friends worked for that team actually and was an ex-journalist, and they ended up closing that team. But I'd way rather trust the judgment of humans, for example, in deciding which news stories are highlighted at the side of my feed, rather than trusting an algorithm that, you know, isn't human and doesn't have that level of judgment that we can trust at all. So, yeah, in terms of opening up the black box, I think that's another question. And, you know, I imagine that's pretty difficult, but, you know, it's very interesting that the ACCC has flagged that as the live option of let's open it up. Facebook and other tech giants like Google said it's not workable, but, you know, it's good we're at least talking about it.
Look, of course, as many things in this, it seems to play out slightly different in Australia. The other development, which I'm interested in, you leading us through, David, this week, was that the Prime Minister's called for holding platforms account for the content they publish and sort of make them have be vulnerable to defamation law in much the same way as a publisher. The context of this is also terrific in that Barnaby Joyce has lathered up over that because there has been some social media commentary around one of his daughters and a senior New South Wales politician who resigned, which kind of inversely reflect the accurate social media whispering campaign about his own behaviour a couple of years ago. But that sort of morphed yesterday into a call for a big review on the platforms allowing anonymous trolls to spread disinformation. And where does that land us?
Yeah, so ScoMo is saying that the tech giants should be or are in danger of being labelled as publishers in the way that publishers like News Corp right now are. And I can tell you, as someone inside a newsroom right now, what we've got now is not workable. We have our moderators who work for the Australian are only, say, for example, working 9 to 5, and then they have to shut off comments the hours that they're not working, and they have to go through basically every single one and make sure that there's nothing defamatory being posted on any of our articles on the tech giants platforms, because we would be liable as the publisher. And it's basically the tech giants abdicating their responsibility for what's on their platforms, saying that we should be liable just because the article came from us, even though it's hosted on the tech giants.
This bounces off the Dylan Volker High Court, and which we spoke about last week, or last fortnight. But yeah, from the perspective of a newsroom, as Dan shared last week, it's probably terrible. From the perspective of someone that wants to cut off the flow to Facebook, it's probably not such a bad outcome. But
yeah,
what do you think? Can
I ask you, David? Yeah. I don't really understand the thinking behind allowing comments on Facebook on news articles, other than it plays into the Facebook algorithm for promoting content. Because what we know from the Whistleblower and from the Facebook papers is that if you get comments, and if they're long comments, your point score is going up and your news article with its comments below is going to be promoted. I mean, I assume that's why you permit comments on this platform. So then I find it just a bit hard to take when news organizations complain about the fact that they're going to be held to account for that when they've actually optimized their content for the platform that they're on. It is possible just to, not publish on Facebook, but also it may be possible that Facebook eventually comes up with a product where News Limited is able to put stories on there and not solicit comments. It might not do as well, but it would mean that, people don't get defamed. One of the things I keep raising in this context is Dylan Voller went through a terrible, terrible thing, and people were saying awful things about him. And especially when it comes to News Corp does, and the Australian particularly, does sometimes target individuals for campaigns of vitriol. And I do think it's right that there's a remedy for those people. I do think there's problems with defamation, but I also think, this constant kind of retrofitting these programs so that we can continue to push content that's just engaging without necessarily caring about the consequences for people who might be caught up in that. To me, that's unworkable and should be fixed as well. Don't want to hold you totally responsible for Murdoch there, David, so hopefully you'll take that in good humour.
Yeah, all I'd say is I'll appear in my personal capacity rather than representing the Murdoch empire. All I would say too is following the news media bargaining code for example, we're in a unholy alliance with the tech giants now going forward, and there's no going back from that. Really, I think that was a moment in time where obviously Facebook blocked news from its platform, and the outcome could have been totally different, where then it's a permanent split. All comments stay on our site, no comments on Facebook, no news stories on Facebook. And you have that real permanent divide where it's very clear where the content lies. And I think now we're at just this weird time where we're back together and we're working out who owns what and who's responsible for what. And it really does need to form part of a much broader defamation reform. We have, some of the worst defamation laws. I'm sure you guys have talked about it before, but, globally, the defamation laws in general aren't workable with this aspect, but then more broadly too, in terms of stuff we're allowed to write. But that's another conversation. But I won't go into the News Corp articles that you mentioned. Yeah.
Very, very professional, David.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Lizzie, let's hand the conch to you. You wanted to shift away from Facebook and just share a bit of information about an exciting new robot that Amazon is offering us all.
And I don't know if anybody's been checking out what's going on with Amazon and their new robot called Astro, which I think is an unforgivable thing to call a robot, because the true Astro is Astro Boy, not Amazon's surveillance robot. I think this has been very interesting to watch this unfold, because there's a lot of slick marketing around Astro. There's a lot of interesting ways in which it is being marketed as a source of safety and comfort in your home against intruders, for example, as well as doing things like being very personable, having a dance party with Astro. I don't know if anybody's watched the ad, but you can watch the ad online, and it does seem like Astro solves a lot of your problems. Having said that, don't know why anyone would want to put the eyes and ears of Jeff Bezos in their house, wandering around, checking on things, using facial recognition to work out who is where, when. And I wonder whether that will be a way in which people start to not engage with these products because they can't trust Amazon. And some of the reading about this is really interesting, actually, about how we use robots and what we perceive them to do in our lives, and whether I'm in fact just being a bit idealistic in saying that people are going to perhaps balk at the prospect of inviting Jeff Bezos into their home, when in fact there's a lot of reason why people buy robots and invest in them as a potential emblem, I suppose, of an ideal future. And there's a really interesting article on the MIT tech review, where they talk about how the way in which robots are built and their features that they're given play into our evolutionary history to make us like them and feel dependent on them. And people talk, the article discusses, hugging robotic animals and that being as fulfilling as hugging a real animal. I can tell you, I can probably understand that, because they're less likely to scratch you if they're a cat, for example. But, people even know, when they know that it's a robot, they still feel a connection with it. And I'm sure that in the process of designing this, Amazon has thought about this quite a bit. And so it will become a feature of our home that we sort of can't do without. It becomes a member of the family. It's like Jeff's there every night when you're having dinner with your kids. And the last thing I just want to throw out there as an interesting provocation around this is that article talked actually about how children distinguish between things that are living, say, or that are, have, a consciousness by whether they're self-propelled or not, which I hadn't really thought about, I must say. So a rock is not self-propelled, nor is a tree, but a person and an animal is. And now we're going to be introducing robots into our homes around small children. What does that mean for their understanding of what is human and what isn't, or what is an animal and what isn't? And then if you bring into the mix marketing that might come through that robot, what does that mean as well? And these are things that I don't think anybody's really thought about. I imagine Amazon has, but I'd be very reluctant to introduce something into my home. And I do wonder whether we have to be very careful about what we're kind of teaching the next generation. I did say that was the last thing, but one more. I think it is hilarious that apparently it doesn't recognize stairs. So if you are going to buy one, against my recommendations, don't put it anywhere near a staircase, because even one of the most sophisticated tech companies in the world can't make a robot that can avoid falling downstairs.
David, you're the sort of go-to guy for a tech company with a new idea. How do you treat the robot, the Astro?
With great suspicion, and it's big coming from me. If you saw my house right now, it's just littered with tech junk that the companies send me. And I don't think I would let this into my home. I let a lot of other tech things into my home, but I think Amazon often goes under the radar just in terms of its sheer sort of the amount it knows about us, I think it's got potential to be bigger than sort of Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Google in terms of just sheer influence. And when it comes to issues like privacy and I think Amazon just often doesn't enter that conversation when it should. I mean, it has Amazon Web Services, which is, powers a significant portion of the internet. It knows all of our shopping habits. It's become huge in Australia. It wasn't a few years ago, but now it really is, just in terms of day-to-day shopping. And the amount of data they have on us is incredible. So letting this robot into my home where it can then see all my facial expressions and my kids, etc., my future kids, I guess, just, huge red flags for me. And especially with something at a sort of V1 in early days, Amazon's shown before it needs, like a lot of other companies, just many iterations to even get close to getting something right. So wouldn't be letting Astro anywhere near this place.
It kind of seems this weird merging of security, convenience, and almost anxiety. So I'm assuming people are going to be attracted to this if they're leaving their kids alone, or they've got a older parent who's living alone and the phone call doesn't cut it anymore. But you got to say, there must be other ways of solving that problem than programming this all-consuming and very complex piece of technology just to start roaming in your loved one's domain.
Do you have stairs, Peter, that it might not be able to conquer?
It would not last 5 minutes where I am at the moment, but maybe, I don't quite know how I would apply it up here. I'm just not going to, though. I'm not an Alexa person either. Like, I just don't like the idea of having that presence. I like sort of programming my own stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I also think there's this weird drive now to automate all these functions, like looking after loved ones that you can't visit. And then what do we do with our time? We spend all our time. Yeah, we spend all our time working. So what? You can work more, so you don't have to go see your loved ones. Like, I mean, I think that aspect of it is a bit insidious and gross. The security stuff, I think, is equally troublesome. It's like I don't know, for people who've watched White Lotus, it reminds me of the really rich guy who's very worried about an invader in the hotel, and he's just the terrible character in the series, and is fearful that people will come after his wealth, which is kind of understandable on one level, but it takes the form, I shouldn't give it away, but the point is that there's a fear culture which justifies then increasingly relying on these, not just as a source of convenience, but also as a source of security about the existential crisis we face, even though all the evidence suggests that crime is going down and the like. And we create this culture of fear and the need that then is serviced by these private companies in very invasive ways. I do think we have to start talking about breaking that dynamic.
Andrew's got a really great comment in the chat with the question, isn't it regulation and not consumer choice that will limit Amazon's collection of customer data ultimately? And I guess that's the point. It feels to me, Lizzie, that a new product like this comes into a world that hasn't even countenanced the regulation of a product like this, because no one was so crazy to think about it except when they were watching the Jetsons. So it's a bit of a segue into our discussion with Anna around privacy law, but it feels to me that it just reinforces that the fact that this is going to be out on the market without, there might be a ticker box consent when you get it or something, but without any real thought on what the implications of the information being collected and how it's going to be used is kind of almost the sort of elephant in the room.
I think that's definitely a fair comment, because, if you did want something that used facial recognition technology, for example, there's no need that would have to then go back to the third party like Amazon. You could have a device where it's like facial recognition when you unlock your phone, it just stays on the device. But of course, what we know is that Amazon won't be using that. They'll be taking this opportunity to enter into your home and gather up all the data that it can possibly get its hands on. And it's telling, I think, that we had a proposed law in respect of facial recognition for the regulation of the use of that technology. It was canned by our relevant parliamentary committee, and there's been nothing since, although we expect it to come soon. And in that gap, we have agencies, companies using that technology in a regulatory-free environment. And, this is their business model, to enter the space and then ask for forgiveness or regulation later once they've got a hold on the market and have put in place practices and also habits on the parts of consumers that then become very difficult to break.
That is a good segue into our deep dive, and I'll bring Anna into the conversation now. So Anna works at Salingers, who are like the go-to lawyers on privacy issues, been working in this space way before surveillance capitalism. Anna, we got you on because we thought the privacy bill would have landed by now, and so we were going to get you to unpack it. And also convince us why privacy isn't the dismal, boring part of the technology discussion. You know, we've been talking about robots and global captains of the world, and here we're going to talk about privacy. Tell us a bit about why this is really important, and also a little bit about what you're looking for out of this review.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to challenge you on the idea that privacy is dismal. I think it's the most exciting area to work in because I get to work every day at this fantastic intersection between law, technology, and ethics. So if you're talking Facebook or if you're talking Astro robots in the home, the solutions that you're already alluding to is actually about building in what's known as privacy by design, actually anticipating what are the privacy issues going to be. And these kind of technologies should be designed to protect our privacy instead of the default being that kind of surveillance capitalism model or the privacy invading model. I don't think it's true to say that no one has thought of these issues. Since we were kids and watched the Jetsons, we've had plenty of thought into these issues, and we know that we need better regulation in this space. It's not like the Astro robots, the first kind of, internet connected surveillance device in your home. It's by no means the first. It might be the cutest and most cuddly and the current thing on the market. But so far, globally, legislators and regulators have failed to truly grapple with this. Some of the privacy regulators and consumer protection regulators have started to touch on these issues, but we need so much more work in this space. So the review of the Australian Privacy Act is absolutely timely. So where we're at with that, that we've had privacy laws in Australia since the late 80s, regulating government, regulating the private sector since 2001. What's really spurred on the demand for a fresh review of them and an update of our Federal Privacy Act. First of all is the behaviour of the big digital platforms, so Google and Facebook in particular. So the ACCC's digital platforms inquiry from a few years ago now recommended a number of updates were needed to our privacy laws to address the power imbalances and the kind of harms that can occur to us as individuals and us as society because of the power of the big digital platforms. But that's not the only driver. But that's one of the big drivers. Another is the need for Australia to give its privacy laws a bit of a makeover to make them equivalent or considered adequate to European standards, because that will actually open up the possibility for more data flows to come from Europe to Australia. At the moment, there's kind of a blockage because Australia is not recognised as having adequate privacy laws to a European standard. And there's just a lot happening in the global tech regulation space generally. These are all reasons why we need a bit of an update to the Australian privacy laws.
So you've got me, it's important. What are we looking for in this review, and how long since we've updated the laws?
So the laws got a bit of a tinker in 2014, but that didn't really change the sort of underlying model. So one of the problems we've got with our privacy laws at the moment is it doesn't embed an actual right to privacy in a human rights sense. Another problem is that our privacy laws are built on an assumption that what we need to regulate is what's defined as personal information, which means information about people who can be identified from that information. So the assumption is that if you cannot be identified from the information, you will not suffer any privacy harm. That assumption no longer holds true. That was true before the internet. In the digital world, that assumption does not hold true. We've seen all the revelations about Facebook, not just the most recent ones, but all of those revelations, and it's not just Facebook, it's the sort of whole digital ecosystem thrives on being able to target and manipulate us at an individual level without needing to exactly know who we are. to, you know, to an advertiser, to a platform. Each of us is just a bundle of attributes that can be targeted and manipulated and sold things, and you know, and newsfeed manipulated and all the rest. So first of all, the Privacy Act needs to be updated in terms of what kind of data is being protected in the first place. It also needs to be updated to more explicitly reflect the fact that what we are doing in terms of privacy laws, the objective of privacy laws, is to protect people from privacy harms, including digital harms, not just protect our data. The whole point of protecting data is to protect the people in the data. So we need to be more explicit about saying this is actually about protecting human beings, and collectively, individually and collectively as a society.
That's moving much more to the effect of surveillance rather than just the idea of you've got to be able to click a box and understand what the clicker box means, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need a better focus on what's the end result we want to achieve, what's the kind of society we want to live in, and what do we want to avoid. Another thing, picking on upon your comment about the ticker box kind of, or, you know, click the consent button. This is another thing. So again, the ACCC from the Digital Platforms Inquiry said, we are asked too often to click on that button. I agree. And it, you know, the I agree button. The idea that we are consenting to, whether it's digital platforms or your supermarket loyalty card or your airline or your bank or whoever, the government collecting your data, it's overused. The idea that we are making us click on the button in order to download the app or buy the good or service or access services from government. It's not a true consent. So we need to actually elevate the legal standard for achieving consent, but at the same time, we actually want organisations not to have to rely on our consent. Consent should be only asked of us as individual consumers, as citizens, for things that are really unusual. So part of what the review of the Privacy Act it wants to focus on, and I think will focus on, is saying, let's actually look at routine business practices, make sure that they are fair. Like, let's apply an overarching fairness test and say, as long as it's routine and fair and expected, go for it. If it's outside, if you're stepping outside that box and you want to do something really unusual with someone's data, now you need to ask for their consent. But that consent must be freely given. It can't be that ticker box, I have to consent in order to get, you know, download the app or whatever it is. So a rethinking of consent is another big, I think it's going to be one of the themes to come out of the Act review.
Now, I'm really anti-consent as the model for privacy, because, you know, even if, you know, you're consenting to it, that data that you share with a large company like Facebook, for example, can be repurposed and used as analytics for people who haven't shared their information. I mean, Cambridge Analytica was an example of that, but, you know, Facebook says that was unlawful. But even more generally, you can create lookalike audiences so that someone who's never shared anything with the platform then is susceptible to having information that looks like them used against them, you know, or used directed at them for advertising purposes. And I think that's kind of dead. But I did want to ask you, and I guess just like zooming out a little bit, there's a huge economy in sharing data and data analytics. I don't know how it's kind of justified, because to me, it doesn't seem to serve much purpose, the whole industry of data mining, except that it facilitates advertising. Do you agree, or do you think we should be paying more attention to that industry-wide phenomenon of data harvesting and mining that's occurred in the last sort of 10 years, I suppose, most meaningfully, and trying to target that industry? Because the other thing about it, I suppose, is most people, I don't think, realize quite how extensive it is and what it does. But I'm not sure if that's a useful starting point to kind of think about the concept of privacy.
I think it is. I think it's, you know, the hottest topic in terms of privacy, and the where we're seeing the most harm at the moment. But I don't think that I wouldn't want to see sort of a Privacy Act split in half, and these are the rules that apply to digital platforms or to the advertising ecosystem, and these are the rules for everyone. I think it needs to be one set of rules for everyone. And at the moment, part of the problem we have is that, as I said, especially the big platforms, often they can say, well, you don't need to worry about privacy because we don't know who the people are in a legal sense. So we're going to go and collect all their data and harvest it. And, they'll say, don't worry, we've de-identified it, so therefore no one can be harmed. But as you've said, people can be harmed whether they're in the original data set or not. That's where the power of these platforms comes from. And the problem is that privacy laws at the moment are constrained in how well they can rein in that kind of behaviour. I think the focus needs to be on changing the business model, whether it's online advertising, whether by selling a brand of sneakers or promoting your brand of car, or whether you are pushing active misinformation about vaccines or climate change conspiracy theories, whatever it is. Those platforms, their power comes from our data, and they're abusing that power in a way that hurts us as individuals and as a society. And that absolutely needs to be reined in. And I think privacy law is one of the tools, not the only tools, but it's one of the regulatory tools that can be used to impact on that.
Is de-identification the weak point? Because you're talking about personal information there, and then once it's de-identified, it's no longer personal information, and there's no definition of what it is to de-identify. So that's a problem, because there's potentially the risk that it could be re-identified. But is that what you're talking about then, saying that de-identified information still has to be subject to the Privacy Act, or is there another method that we could use?
Yeah, so certainly a number of submissions to the review, including from privacy regulators, have said it's time that we kept even de-identified information within the scope of regulation, because people can be re-identified from it more and more easily, but B, and I think more importantly, even if it remains de-identified, the power of the technology is that we can be located and individuated, found and targeted and manipulated as individuals, even if a platform or an advertiser doesn't know who we are. So it might still be, to the extent that you can say something is perfectly de-identified, which is itself contentious. But if you can say it's perfectly de-identified at the platform level, at the advertiser level, it doesn't matter in terms of the end harms that can still happen to us as individuals. So the problem is that the power of the platforms, that they can individuate us, they can segment us, they can manipulate us, they can, through online behavior, they can shape our experience of the world. So it's through the filter bubbles built by algorithms that have been fed on our own data to start with. And the end result of the filter bubbles and their echo chambers and the dark patterns and the emotional contagion studies and the misinformation and the manipulation of news feeds is that our world actually becomes smaller. Our choices, contrary to the idea of opening up the world, our world's becoming smaller. Our choices become more limited. The products we're offered are different to the person sitting next to us. The prices that we pay will be different to our next door neighbour. The job ads we see, the news stories we read, all of this becomes decided for us by machines, built not to serve us. They're built to deliver profits to the owners of big tech. And ultimately, that narrowing of our choices impacts our autonomy and our dignity. And this is what privacy law is supposed to protect. This is what privacy, to me, ultimately means, is autonomy and dignity. It's not about the protection of our data per se. That's just the proxy for what we're really supposed to be protecting, which is our individual autonomy and dignity and our ability to control our own lives. We're not going to get that back. Our ability to run our own lives free of kind of surveillance capitalism and corporate interference, until we really tackle not just one company. It's not just about breaking up Facebook. It's not just about giving users extra controls. It's about actually unpacking and better regulating the entire digital and data ecosystem.
David, I know you are not the official emissary of Holt Street in any shape or form, but what is the perspective, as you perceive, of the media in general to privacy law reform? I know that it's been seen in the past as one of the barriers of getting laws through, the reticence of media companies to change the current regime, which provides a fair bit of protection for them in their operations.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that, we have a company position that I'm aware of necessarily.
Yeah.
I think in general, us as journalists are sort of have been pro reform, and I think we've looked at what's happened in Europe as a really successful model with GDPR. I think, you know, there are a lot of questions. I remember reporting on it at the time. There were a lot of concerns in terms of how it would actually play out, and to me, it looks to have played out really well, and looks like a really great model for us to, you know, not copy but to learn from and build on. I did have a question for Anna, if that's okay. People tell me all the time that the horse has bolted, and I'm sure you get it a lot too, where it's, you know, privacy is dead, and we just have to get used to that and move on. I mean, when people say that, what do you say in terms of what makes you optimistic about sort of real action here and getting everyday people to care about it, and, you know, that privacy is not dead in a societal form?
Yeah, I absolutely don't think privacy is dead. Well, maybe I'm just an optimist. I haven't given up, but I've absolutely seen a change in about the last 3 years. So I'd say starting with the Cambridge Analytica revelations, people, as in members of the public, you know, when you meet someone at a barbecue, back to when we have barbecues again, I'll be excited. But, you know, you meet someone, you're at the barbecue or at a supermarket, and they ask what you do. Before 2018, people would either say, oh, isn't privacy dead? Or is that the same as piracy? Or, you know, intellectual property or something. They didn't really understand. Ever since Cambridge Analytica, people are like, oh, that is really important, you know, or they've seen the movie Social Dilemma. I think people do get it. We absolutely know from surveys of like community attitude research in Australia and globally that people are becoming more and more concerned about privacy, not less. We know that social media platforms in particular have extremely low levels of trust, even as they have very high levels of engagement. And that's a paradox we have to deal with. But absolutely, privacy is not dead. And I don't see why. I don't buy the line, you know, the kind of too big to fail. I know when Facebook went down earlier this week, and, you know, advertisers and a whole bunch of businesses that rely on Facebook and their related platforms would have been struggling, which demonstrates just how much power they have. But we as individuals get to vote, and we get to shape our parliaments, and the parliaments get to shape the legislation, which ultimately chooses, you know, the shape of the world that we live in. And
but
nothing.
Anna, isn't that one of the political challenges? That so many businesses have bought into the surveillance model of marketing. So it's not just that you're up against big Facebook, you're up to every business that's chosen that is their cheapest and most effective way of building a customer base, right? And every political movement, with the laudable and notable exception of Digital Rights Watch, who uses Facebook to target out and build their community of little political activists. So it's kind of not just about reining in the power of the big guys. It's also about the whole model that's been built on the back of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I mean, it's, you know, the calls to kind of delete Facebook or break up Facebook will not ultimately solve the problem, which is we have to, first of all, value our personal information, not let companies monetize it and suck it up without rules around them, in order to build digital platforms and social networks which are not privacy invasive. We need better models. And I'm not saying that I'm going to be the one to build it or the one to design it. But yeah, we need better alternatives, and opening up companies like Facebook and others to greater scrutiny, and having rules about, product safety, ensuring that the products they're building and selling are not toxic to teens or children or anyone else, or to undermining of our democracy or undermining of public health messaging. All of those things need to be tackled in order to create a digital world where we can have, activists building their communities and advertisers marketing their products, but in a way that doesn't cause harm to us as individuals or to societies and democracies.
We have just been talking about really like privacy, the idea of privacy as being about autonomy or self-determination, which I think is a really important way to talk about privacy, because it's usually framed as, I just want to seal off my world from view. I want to shut my front door and no one's allowed in. I want to be able to do whatever I like in my closed environment, as opposed to a right to be in public space without being watched, for example, and to be able to determine your own destiny. But I did want to take the opportunity to ask you, Anna, about the other component of privacy, which is also security, and whether this is something that you've thought much about in the context of the Privacy Act review, because there are a lot of products now being created that, if you're a vulnerable person for a variety of reasons, can be very destructive to your life. The obvious example being women who are fleeing a violent partner. Almost any product they use, or if they had Astro might not recognize their violent partner as an intruder, for example, among other things. But I did wonder whether you had thoughts about this. One, I'm a lawyer, so of course I also am a hammer and everything looks like a nail. I always think we need a cause of action for invasion of privacy, both to deal with that autonomy question, because I think that's an invasion of privacy as autonomy, but also for a security aspect to come to the fore, that, as an individual, I have a right to have products that are secure and not used against me because the designers haven't thought through the implications of what they've done. What do you think about, I guess, that idea of a cause of action and using courts for that process, as well as more generally this idea of privacy as security?
Yeah, so in terms of an individual cause of action, so say a statutory tort of privacy is something that has been thought about for years, recommended by the Australian Law Reform Commission, amongst others, bipartisan parliamentary committees. They keep recommending it. It never goes anywhere politically. I'm in favour of a statutory tort of privacy for serious invasions of privacy, but I also recognise that bringing a court action, I mean, this is rich person's justice. So it is not, it's one tool in the toolkit to address serious invasions of privacy. It's useful for wealthy people. It's useful for organisations, advocacy bodies, if they've got the money to bring causes of action where either the legislature has failed or the regulator has failed to rein in the power of companies, or the legislation has failed to cause, whether it's companies like Amazon or whoever, to design their products safely. So a statutory cause of action, I think, is useful. I'm all in favour of it, but it's not a panacea, and it should not be the only tool in the toolkit. Just as proposals to increase user controls or algorithmic transparency, as you were talking about earlier, are all useful things, but none of these things alone will solve these problems.
Hey, Anna, I'm happy to cede to you, Lizzie, and then I'll have a final question.
Okay, sorry. I was just going to put in one more pitch, which is I get what you're saying about that being true for individuals, but I am a class actions lawyer, and I do see the utility in lots of people coming together and then taking on a large company in circumstances where they couldn't do it alone. And so I sort of see the possibility of a statutory cause of action quite expansively in that way. I don't think it would be like defamation, because I know journalists kind of don't love the idea because they sort of see it as like defamation limits the capacity to do investigative reporting. But I wouldn't lose hope that courts, well-designed laws, particularly in this context, but also say in relation to disclosure by company directors, which is the other big shareholder class action space, they actually have a big impact on people's lives, and they're worth pursuing. But anyway, that's because I'm a lawyer.
I just wanted to spend the rest of the time just asking you, Anna, if there was any roadmaps that you think are a good path to follow. Like, we're not the first to go down this path. GDPR, there's the Californian laws. Is there a model that you think says this is the way, or is there little bits that we should be grabbing from different parts of the world?
I think there's little bits we can grab from different parts of the world. So the GDPR is often held up as the kind of global benchmark for privacy laws. It's certainly got some eye-grabbing, eye-watering kind of level penalties, which is why it gets lots of attention. It also has some great features, like, as I talked about before, it's spelled out in law what we at the moment just have in case law and in regulatory guidance, which is what are the elements you need to get a valid consent, if you're going to rely on someone's consent as the lawful ground for you to collect or use or disclose their information in the first place. It also starts to go towards my point about expanding the definition of personal information. So it includes the notion of singling out So it's not necessarily hinging entirely on whether or not this sort of argument that Lizzie was alluding to about whether or not someone's actually identifiable in a legal sense in the first place. But there's also other laws around the world which kind of pick up that idea and run with it. So the California Consumer Privacy Act, for example, has an even more expansive definition of personal information. So within its sort of regulatory purview, it covers information that can be used to not just identify with someone, but locate or target them or a household or a device connected with an individual or a household. So that's a useful model. The Canadian law has the idea of no-go zones. And the Canadian Privacy Commissioner uses techniques like focus groups to take the pulse of the community to actually understand what is kind of fair and reasonable. And of course, community attitudes can shift over time, so that it actually offers quite a useful flexibility in the privacy law. So there's I think we can
ongoing focus groups. That works for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's bits and pieces we can pick from different jurisdictions, I think, to build something really world class.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, thanks for your thoughts and wisdom.
My pleasure.
I'm now looking forward to this report lobbying and feeling like I'm not going to be totally faking it through it. So thank you very much for your for being part of it today. Thanks for joining us, David. We normally finish the week just with what's coming up over the fortnight. I don't know if there's anything particular apart from the privacy review that you're looking forward to over the next fortnight.
I'm just hoping for several more major Facebook outages just to give me more to report. That would be great. Yeah, just more big tech, bring it on. It's keeping me very distracted from this lockdown and the global pandemic, which is great.
Excellent. So thanks for being part of it today, mate. And Lizzie, anything on the Digital Rights Watch agenda for the next couple of weeks?
I mean, we've got some more events coming up. We did hold a successful event talking to writers about how we can make the internet work for them, because there've been people that have been ignored, artists as well, by the federal government in the context of the pandemic. Make use of the digital infrastructure to share their work, but it needs to work for them and not just for the platforms in which they share. So that's part of an ongoing series. If you want to know more about our next event, which is coming up soon, then you can sign up to our newsletter. I'm also looking forward to more Facebook outages, because I hope that encourages people to realize that when we put all our eggs in the Facebook basket, we might be putting ourselves at risk, that we won't control that environment. So, building outside of those spaces, your community, your organization, your business is a good idea.
Excellent. Well, have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks for being part of it. We'll be back in a fortnight. Like we were saying, we are now a pod as well. So please spread the word around. There's been a few people in the chat saying, this is great. Wish there were more people coming along. We had 100 in the room today. I think that's great. And we're trying to grow this and grow the community. So thanks for being part of it, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.